Criterion number 3, contextual credibility. Here he says, any tradition about Jesus that cannot be plausibly situated in first century Palestinian context cannot be accepted as historically reliable. Any tradition about Jesus that cannot be plausibly situated in first century Palestinian context cannot be accepted as historically reliable. Well, now that's just a truism. And the problem with that truism is that it's purely negative, and so it doesn't establish what is historical about Jesus. It would just exclude something that would be unhistorical, but it doesn't establish anything positively about Jesus. The correct formulation of the criterion of contextual credibility would be traditions about Jesus which cohere well with already established facts about Jesus have a good probability of being historically reliable. Traditions about Jesus which cohere well with already established facts about Jesus have a good probability of being historically reliable. So, correctly understood then, we have 4 criteria for establishing traditions about Jesus: independent attestation, dissimilarity, embarrassment, and contextual credibility. Now let me show next Bart Ehrman's misuse of the criteria of authenticity. First, his use of the criteria results in a distortion of the historical Jesus. A real historical person is a much richer reality than what can be proved about a person. Think of Napoleon, for example. The historical Napoleon is a much, much richer figure than what we can prove about Napoleon, right? What you can prove about Napoleon is a small subset of the man who actually lived. We don't know a lot of things about his private life or what he was doing that wasn't recorded by historians. But Ehrman equates, quote, a strictly historical perspective with what we can show on historical grounds. He equates the historical Jesus with what you can prove about Jesus. And that leads to a reconstructed Jesus, which is a pale abstraction of the robust reality that actually lived. The historical Jesus who actually lived is a much richer reality than what we can prove about Jesus. They're not the same thing. Now, the next major point I want to make is that the criteria, when properly used, show the reliability of traditions about Jesus, but Ehrman tries to use them negatively to show unreliability. He misuses the criteria. The criteria can be properly used only to establish positively historical elements about Jesus, but Ehrman uses them negatively to try to show unreliability. For example, he says, and I quote, some of the best-known traditions of Jesus' birth cannot be accepted as historically reliable when gauged by our criteria. Some of the best-known traditions of Jesus' birth cannot be accepted as historically reliable when gauged by our criteria. Notice that's a negative use of the criteria. But the criteria can't be used negatively to establish non-historicity. They can only be used positively to establish historicity. So it's impossible, when they're used properly, to say that these birth narratives are shown to be unhistorical in nature. What he should say is that some of the best-known traditions of Jesus' birth cannot be positively proven to be historical by these criteria. And that's unobjectionable. There can be lots of things about Jesus that we cannot prove using these criteria that are nevertheless recorded in the gospel. So you see how he slides from saying these birth traditions cannot be proven to be historical by the criterion to saying that therefore they cannot be accepted as historically reliable on the basis of these criteria. Or here's another example. We don't have any reliable information concerning what Mary actually thought of Jesus because the traditions are not multiply attested and don't pass the criterion of dissimilarity. See the negative use of the criteria there? Because they're not multiply attested, because they're not dissimilar. Therefore, he says, none of this information is reliable that we have in the Gospels. You can't use the criterion negatively in that way.